On March 11, 2011, one of the biggest earthquakes in Japan's history resulted in a devastating tsunami that claimed thousands of lives. Furthermore, this catastrophic event also led to the worst radiation disaster since the Chernobyl incident in 1986. This special report will focus on the Fukushima nuclear plant disaster and its effects on the food and health of the Japanese people and the rest of the world. In an article written just shortly after the disaster on Infowars.com titled 40 Years of Spent Fuel Rods Blows Sky High, it says, in addition to underreporting the fires at Fukushima, the Japanese government has not told the people about the ominous fact that the nuclear plant site is a hellish repository where a staggering number of spent fuel rods have accumulated for 40 years. It goes on to say that each assembly holds 63 fuel rods. This means the Fukushima Daiichi plant may contain over 600,000 spent fuel rods. There have been massive design issues with the Mark I nuclear reactor stretching back for 3 decades. At the time of the disaster, ABC News reported that 35 years ago, Dale G. Bridenbach and 2 of his colleagues at General Electric resigned from their jobs after becoming increasingly convinced that the nuclear reactor design they were reviewing, which was the Mark I, was so flawed it could lead to a devastating accident.
Reports from Japan say there's been an explosion at a nuclear power station where there was already an emergency after yesterday's earthquake. A white cloud has been seen rising from the site at the Fukushima No. 1 plant. Japanese TV reports speak of several workers having been injured. The authorities have already been evacuating 20,000 people from the area around the plant, fearing possible meltdown. There'd already been problems with cooling systems at both Fukushima plants. The government warned of possible radiation at the first before irregularities at the second were then discovered. Radiation detected at the central control unit of the plant's No. 1 reactor had already risen to many times the normal level after the cooling system was knocked out.
Another article talks about the greater danger lying in the spent fuel than in the actual reactors. And it says that figures provided by Tokyo Electric Power on Thursday show that most of the dangerous uranium at the power plant is actually in the spent fuel rods, not the reactor cores themselves. Another article talking about the spent fuel rods posing grave danger. Now, at the time of of reactor number 2 being ruptured, the U.S. Navy had even pulled back its aircraft carrier, the USS Ronald Reagan, after 17 of its crew were exposed to radiation while flying 60 miles off the Japanese coast. And it goes on to talk about the spent fuel rods. It says exposing them to air for a day or two, they begin to combust, giving off large amounts of radioactive cesium-137, which is a very toxic, long-lasting, aggressively penetrating radioactive element with a half-life of 30 years. When cesium-137 enters the environment, it essentially acts like potassium and is taken up by the plants and animals that use potassium. And for the record, that includes you. There are also reports suggesting that fragments or particles of those nuclear fuel rods that were above the reactors were blown up to 1 mile from the units when there was an explosion, and that the pieces of the radioactive material fell between the 2 units and had to be bulldozed over, presumably to protect workers at the site. So it's suggesting that these spent fuel rods have just been buried wherever they landed, which that can be very dangerous for the soil and what we grow in the soil later on.
Still, these plants are still leaching radioactivity into the environment every day, into the sea and through the steam of the cooling into the air. And what's now preoccupying many people in Japan is that even for those of us that live far enough away that we thought we were not in any way threatened by the radiation from the plants, we're now finding that because of insufficient oversight to the food supply and public health questions, that radiation is turning up in all kinds of food products. distance. So you're finding now people in far away from Fukushima areas are now beginning to realize that they're not going to be escaping the radiation because of that distance. And additionally, besides that, there's still a rather chaotic policy about what will be happening in the areas that were contaminated near the plants, but outside of the evacuation zone, for example, Fukushima City.
Well, as we know, some people in Japan are accusing the government of holding back information about the true scale of the disaster. And earlier, we saw protests in Tokyo and other cities. So what's happening now? Does that still seem to be the case? Do people have access to what's going on information-wise?
No, it's absolutely, in some ways, it's getting worse. We know that that neither TEPCO, Tokyo Electric, or the government informed the public when they knew that there had been full nuclear meltdowns. People were not told to evacuate at that time. And in terms of the current situation, there's a great deal of anger, especially among parents in Fukushima Prefecture and nearby, that there's not a comprehensive system to try to protect the health of the people in those areas. So you're seeing meetings every couple of days in which government officials are being yelled at by local residents who are complaining that they're not being given enough information about the health threats to their children and their families. And the situation is in many ways here in Japan compounding. This is a tragedy that that is ongoing. And so even though the earthquake and the tsunami have passed, Japan is very much gripped by the ongoing nuclear crisis, and there doesn't seem to be any end to that crisis in sight. We know that the plants will be leaching radiation for at least one more year, possibly several more years, and it's turning up increasingly in various parts of the food supply in far-flung regions.
Now, with a disaster like this, we must monitor the integrity of our food supply. Since the nuclear disaster at Fukushima, livestock and fresh vegetables have been tested to show high levels of radioactivity. When you contrast this with Chernobyl, you find quite a different approach was taken. For example, Japan has very little regulation on food from the northeast area around Fukushima being sold throughout the country. In fact, this clip here shows a popular Japanese band, Tokyo, encouraging citizens to, quote, support by eating. And it's referring to, of course, eating food from the eastern Japan area.
食べて応援しよう。僕らは今日もいただきますで東日本とがっちりつながっています。食べて応援続けます。
Not only are they not regulating it and not discouraging it, but they're actually encouraging eating food from that area. Now, not only is the food being pushed on themselves, but Fukushima food is being exported as foreign aid to other countries.
The Japanese Foreign Ministry has applied for a $65 million budget to export processed foods from Fukushima Prefecture to developing countries under an Overseas Development Assistance Program. Their apparent intention is to help agriculture producers in radiation-contaminated regions to sell their foods and to earn a livelihood. But these people think this program is a very bad idea. On November 4th, 2011, concerned citizens traveled to the Cabinet Office and other agencies to try to convince the government to abandon their plans to export Fukushima food as foreign aid to the developing world. They handed over petitions and appealed as taxpayers who will be funding this development aid for the plan to be reconsidered. Later, they briefed journalists at the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry.
ほとんどの方が恥ずかしい、やめてほしい、日本の恥はないのかとか、その日本人の心はどこに行ったんだっていうような、そういうことを言われてるんですね。で、やっぱり日本バッシングされる前に、やっぱり放射性物質が日本の暫定基準値以下だと言っても、やっぱり海外には出しちゃいけないんじゃないだろうか。そういう思いで渡してきました。
The foreign ministry argues that sending the Fukushima food to developing countries presents no problem because the radiation contamination levels are below the maximum allowed under Japanese law. However, many ordinary citizens feel that this will come as little comfort to the rest of the world. This is the Shingitsu News Agency reporting from Tokyo.
In contrast to that, to this day, which is over 25 years later, some European countries will not import food from Chernobyl. There have been reports even of school children being forced to eat tainted food.
会津若松市、これは福島原発から約100キロ離れております。この会津若松市在住の女性弁護士さんの発表は大変厳しいものでございました。小学校3人のお子さん、幼稚園1人、4人のお子さんと、今現在妊娠中でいらっしゃいます。7ヶ月くらいだったと思います。そのお子さんがいらっしゃる弁護士さん、実は子どもさん4人と自分の体内もセシウムが検出されたと。で、健康にすぐには、被害はありませんと、大丈夫ですとこう言われたんだけれど、本当に心配です。そして内部被曝ということがやはり心配なので、小学校の子どもたちには学校で牛乳を飲むのをやめなさいと言いましたと。そしたら先生に、牛乳を飲まない子どもは前へ出てらっしゃい。バケツに1人ずつ飲まない子数人いたそうです。バケツに捨てさせられて、なんで飲まないのかという理由を言わされたと。そしてこれを飲まない人は福島県民じゃないと、住む資格はないと言われたそうです。戦前の非国民のようなこういうことがありましたし、笑わないで聞いてください。官房長官、しっかり聞いていただきたい大事な話でございますのでね、大事なところではそんなね笑わないでくださいよ。冗談じゃありませんよ。私が申し上げたいのはね、本当にそういう思いしてるんですよ、福島の方は。
But in contrast, citizens of Chernobyl were only allowed to consume foods imported from outside of the affected areas, some even as far as the United States. Now, with many experts saying from the beginning that Fukushima is far worse than Chernobyl, it leaves many Japanese outraged and concerned about the safety of their food supply and environment.
Well, there was a scare earlier in the week when we found that some 400 kilograms of beef containing the radioactive isotope cesium had been shipped to supermarkets and restaurants around Japan, as far away as Tokyo, and that it contained more than 6 times the safe limit of cesium. Now, this came from a cattle farm that was some 30 kilometres from the Fukushima plant. This new scandal appears to be much wider, both because of the number of cattle that have been shipped and possibly eaten, and also because of the distance from the plant. It's some 70 kilometres away, and more than 42 cows have been shipped and slaughtered in areas around Japan. We don't know exactly how much cesium this beef contained, but we do know that tests on the hay feed that they had been eating equalled more than 76 times the safe limit. Now, based on the estimations that the health authorities here have made, they say you would need to eat a lot of this beef constantly for about a year for it to have any side effects. We know that the health effects of cesium are to alter DNA and cause cancer. So obviously this has caused quite a lot of panic among the Japanese public. They are scrambling for reassurances that their food is safe, and the government, off the back of the earlier vegetable scares this year, is now trying to contain this new radioactivity scare and trying to convince people in Japan and also for their food exports that it's safe to eat.
And they also believed that it was very silly to build reactors on what is clearly a fault line and in an area where they are known to be earthquakes, and now we see the result of having done that. I mean, this is the obvious response.
Do you think that we now know the true extent of this crisis?
No, I know that we don't, because I've actually visited there and I've taken quite sophisticated radiation measuring equipment, and I've been able to satisfy myself that the concentrations of radionuclides on the ground, even as far as 100 and more kilometers away from the plant, are very much higher than they've been saying. And indeed, some measurements that I've been making on air filters from vehicles from as far away as Tokyo show that the concentrations of cesium-137, for example, in these filters is more than 1,000 times higher than, in terms of air concentration, than the air concentration at the peak of the weapons fallout in 1963. So we're talking about serious levels of radioactive nuclides. And the problem is that this is effectively being ignored by the authorities concentrating on the external dose rate. So they say, so long as the external dose rate is not more than so many microsieverts per hour or whatever it happens to be, everybody's going to be safe. In some sense, they're comparing it with natural background radiation. But actually, it cannot be compared with natural background radiation. There's a very high level of contamination, even as far south as Tokyo. For example, we found one sample in Tokyo that had levels of radioactivity higher than levels inside the Chernobyl exclusion zone. It's a very serious matter. I was told by somebody who'd heard this from a TEPCO official who was talking to the Prime Minister of Japan, who said that the releases from the plant are now of the order of 10 to the power 13 becquerels every hour. So we're talking about something that is absolutely ongoing, and it's just being ignored. It's not being adequately reported by the authorities in Japan or indeed in the International Atomic Energy Agency.
Worrying times. Professor Christopher Busby, Scientific Secretary of the European Committee on Radiation Risks, many thanks for speaking to us this evening.
A major book on the effects of Chernobyl, which was recently released, estimates that a resulting million people have died as a result of the Chernobyl nuclear meltdown. Yet it seems that the Fukushima disaster, which is supposed to be far worse, remember, is not being treated anywhere near as cautiously as Chernobyl, it seems. In this clip, a foreigner living in Japan points out various foods found in his local supermarket that are either from Fukushima or of unspecified origin and simply labeled as, quote, product of Japan or domestic product. And this is a YouTube channel called Aluminum Studios. That's this gentleman's video. And he points out these things in the video, but he also points further as he takes that trip to the supermarket. He says, for meat products, a lot of times when you're eating at a restaurant, the servers can rarely tell you exactly where it came from. Example, pork that's grown in one area, and it may be butchered in another area, and then it's packaged in another area. What about the origin of the animal feed also is what I would like to ask. What are they being fed? And also it goes on, yogurt and other dairy products could be affected more by a nuclear accident. And many dairy products shipped throughout the country of Japan are made within that northeast region.
Okay, just one more thing I want to point out in this particular store. These are packs of microwavable rice. They're very fast and convenient, and I use them quite often. These are from Fukushima. This right here says Fukushima Prefecture. Likewise, these packs of rice proudly proclaim Fukushima Prefecture. Fukushima Ken-san. Every effort is being made to do business as normal and sell Fukushima produce, as well as products from the neighboring prefectures, while very little effort is being made to protect consumers from radioactive cesium. Now, fortunately, if we look at the date, this is May 27th, and this is August 31st. Right now, October is rice harvesting season, So this has to be last year's rice. Still made with post-Fukushima water, but nonetheless it's old rice. But you can be certain that very soon the new harvest rice, which has all been cleared for sale despite radioactive cesium, will be on sale. Fish and seafood is a very important part of the Japanese diet. Ever since Fukushima, I've been a little bit concerned about seafood, no matter where it's marked as being from. It was reported in the Mainichi Daily News a while ago that fishermen from Fukushima were actually docking at ports in other prefectures in order to avoid the Fukushima label. Quite a lot of radioactive materials were dumped into the sea. And at this point, I don't really trust anything from the Pacific Ocean, especially because not a lot of tests and analysis have been done as to the contamination and distribution of it in the ocean. Likewise, with random food sampling, I don't expect it to find everything. So for now, at least, seafood is pretty much off my diet. But down here we have an example of something that's just simply marked as a domestic product, kokunai-san, which would mean made in Japan. As I've mentioned before, a lot of food is simply marked as domestic. This applies to meat most of the time as well. So for example, here we have kokusan, domestic, black pork. And on the package it's marked as domestic.
With Japan having about the same land size as the U.S. state of California, and a small percentage of that land suitable for farming, it is common to ship foods produced in one region to all the other parts of the country, and even on to the rest of the world. Many food companies are based in the capital city of Tokyo, and many foods, which are comprised of ingredients from different parts of the country, are being found to be contaminated with cesium. The farmers affected by the nuclear disaster, especially in the northeast region of Japan, are devastated. For some, the land may never be able to be used in their lifetimes. Just because no one wants to buy contaminated food, and who would, it doesn't mean these farmers should be left out to dry. TEPCO, or Tokyo Electric Power Company, and the Japanese government should take care of these farmers. Compensation and relocation assistance should be mandated. Now we look at this disaster and we think, is it poor information or ignorance, or fear that the truth about radiation amounts would cause mass hysteria, or TEPCO's financial and business priorities, or just a willing and blatant disregard for human life and safety that is at the forefront of this ongoing disaster? I recall two articles from around the time of the disaster that were released. One is titled, "At the Behest of Nuclear Power Companies, Government Officials in Japan Soften Language Related to the Threat of Earthquake-Produced Tsunamis Only 8 Days Before Last Year's Disaster." And another one, "The Fukushima Nuclear Power Plant skipped a set of safety regulations or safety inspections. The operator of the nuclear power plant told safety regulators less than 2 weeks before that disaster." So, is this blatant disregard for our safety? And of course, shortly after, what was the U.S. government's answer? It was to raise safe limits the EPA raised what is considered safe for radioactive limits. So the answer is just to raise the limits and say, okay, you're okay. We're just going to wave a magic wand and say, we'll just raise the limit and you'll be safe.
But you mentioned radioactive steam there. I mean, where do we stand in terms of radiation leaks? What are the latest indications of how widespread it could be?
Well, today they've actually found traces of radioactive substances, iodine, which is a radioactive fuel used at Fukushima, inside the tap water systems of in 5 neighbouring prefectures to Fukushima and in Fukushima itself, and more worrying perhaps, even traces as far south as Tokyo in the tap water there. Now, these traces aren't harmful yet. The ones in Fukushima are above the permissible level. But what's worrying is that normally there isn't any traces of radioactive iodine, but there are minuscule traces. And also, what's more, this radiation has also spread to food produce from the Fukushima prefecture. Milk and spinach were tested, and they were found to contain harmful levels, or potentially harmful levels, of radiation in them. And if ingested, then it's feared, although the iodine there has a short half-life, it could prove risky to human health, and it could damage the thyroid. Now,
as for me and my family, and our time spent living in Japan resulted in us falling in love with the Japanese people and their cuisine. Due to this disaster, we cannot continue to purchase products imported to the U.S. from Japan, at least for the time being. And only time will tell if the health effects will truly be as devastating as many experts are warning. Amidst a crisis of this proportion, there is no excuse to not be overly cautious, especially when it comes to the health of children in Japan and around the world. If you haven't realized by now that governments cannot and should not be trusted, then it is time you start researching the present and studying history for this revelation. We are and we will continue to be in prayer for the Japanese people.